Chapter 11 of Armand Durand by Rosanna Leprohon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Paul, as usual, made but a short stay, and his purchases for the invalid and the house completed, he turned his horse's head homewards the following day. On Armand's expressing a wish to return with him to see his sick father, it was hastily vetoed by Paul, who insisted that the fact of his son's leaving his studies would only annoy and fret him, a thing to be carefully avoided in his present suffering state. 2 letters that our hero wrote home shortly after Paul's visit remained without an answer, beyond a few hurried lines from the latter announcing that their father was a little better. Then came a letter from Durand himself, containing a great deal of solemn warning, both from father and aunt, regarding the danger of ill-chosen acquaintances, much formal advice about the necessity of profiting of time, with some plain hints about the expense of his support in town, and in answer to his question of whether he had not better run down into the country for a few days to see them, he was briefly told to remain where he was and profit of his opportunities. All this deeply wounded Armand, who was really guiltless of having done anything to deserve it, and his own letters home grew colder, briefer, and fewer, characteristics which now plainly marked all the family epistles he received in return, with the exception of occasional bulletins from Paul, which, however kind in spirit, contained very little beyond a mention of their father's health and of the irritating change his rheumatic sufferings had wrought in his usually placid temper, together with some dry details regarding the farm or stock. Determined not to brood, if he could help it, over these painful changes, our hero studied, went out when invited, and occasionally, though very rarely, when unable to refuse without giving absolute offense, joined the noisy merrymakings of L'Espérance and his friends. These details, for want of other matter, he frequently mentioned in his letters to Paul, to whom he spoke very unreservedly, even telling in one case how L'Espérance had borrowed money from him, which he had no hopes of ever having repaid. Paul's answering epistles soon became of a nature to invite these confidences more fully, for he often repeated how much such amusing letters enlivened the monotony of the long, dull evenings at home, and how well he enjoyed such graphic descriptions of town life and its pleasures. Of Delima Laurin, Armand spoke rarely. A dawning interest in the young girl, excited far more by her evident partiality for himself than by her beauty, induced a shyness on the topic which made him generally avoid it. In reality, there was very little to write about. A quiet evening at cards or draughts now and then, a carriole drive with her and Mrs. Martel on rare occasions, or a dreamy long talk beside the large double stove, through whose chinks the fire shone redly on cold winter nights, such was the extent of their intimacy. And Mrs. Martel's absences from the room, which occurred with a frequency suggestive at times of design, never caused a tone in his voice to vary, or won a tenderer look towards his beautiful companion. Armand might not have been so indifferent had not another face, wayward, proud, charming, often risen mentally before him, steeling him in a great measure against all other influences. The carnival was very gay, and as Durand was better, so at least Paul wrote, Armand enjoyed without scruple the harmless social pleasures within his reach. He occasionally met Miss de Beauvoir at some of the more recherche of these entertainments, and sometimes enjoyed the rare privilege of a dance with her, during which she was always gracious and friendly in the extreme. Singularly enough, every one of these meetings had the effect of rendering him insensible for weeks after to Delima's charms. Within the last week of the festive season came an intense longing to visit home, even if his presence were unwished for there, and on Shrove Tuesday, the closing day of the carnival, he set out for Allenville. When he came in sight of home, evening was closing in, and he eagerly looked towards the comfortable old farmhouse, expecting to see it cheerfully lighted up. For Lent, that season of fasting and penance, had been from time immemorial ushered in within its substantial walls by feasting and mirth. One light now alone faintly twinkled from the sitting-room window, but nothing discouraged, he pushed on, supposing it was rather early yet for general lighting up, a process usually deferred in the country till the latest possible moment, from economical motives. On arriving, he left his horse to the care of the overjoyed old farm servant, and without farther warning than a short rap, he entered the sitting-room. Anything but festive or cheerful did it look. By the light of a candle burning on a small table near her, Mrs. Ratelle was sewing, whilst Paul Durand was seated in a large chair, one limb swathed in flannel and supported on a stool, his head resting on his hand in gloomy silence. On seeing Armand, his Aunt Francoise hastily rose and affectionately greeted him, but his father, generally quiet and undemonstrative, was unusually so on the present occasion. Indeed, the coldness of his greeting chilled the impetuous warmth with which his son sprang towards him, and whilst wounding the young man deeply, imparted a reserve to his manner and conversation, which the father noticed at once, and inconsistently enough chafed at. The conversation dragged on heavily. There were some sarcastic fears that he would find a visit to the country very dull after his gay town life, and a querulous doubt as to the necessity or wisdom of young men studying professions unless where there was stability of character. Here Armand earnestly asked, "But why do you say that with such emphasis, father? On what ground am I to be condemned for want of steadiness?" "Well, son, your own letters to Paul for the last few weeks, which he has regularly read to us, may have given rise to the idea," was the dry rejoinder. "But was there anything forbidden, anything really wrong told in them?" "This much, boy. They spoke of little else than mirth, feasting, and gaiety, when the old father, whose willing hand furnished money for joining in all this merriment, was lying utterly forgotten by you on a sick bed, a prey to severe suffering and discouragement." Armand half rose to his feet, but Mrs. Ratelle, interpreting aright his indignant look, with a warning, entreating glance towards the invalid's swathed limb and the medicine bottles at his elbow, interposed. "Brother Paul, you must not be too hard on our boy. 'Tis very difficult for a young man to live like a hermit in a gay city." "Paul wrote to me that you were better, father, and when I wished, some weeks ago, to come to see you, grieved, anxious as I was about your ailing health, I was curtly informed by letter that you wished me to remain where I was, and not lose my time." "I did say so once, and Paul wrote to you that I was better out of kindness. Ah! He is a son to be prized, a staff for my old age. What would have become of me, of the farm, of us all, if he too had taken to law or physic? Up early and late, at work from morning till night, no party going, oyster suppers, or white kid gloves for him, my hard-working, industrious boy. He makes money instead of spending it." Deeper grew the flush on Armand's cheek as his father continued in this strain, and he was on the point of breaking forth, despite his Aunt Ratelle's beseeching looks, into hasty rejoinder, when the entrance of Paul effected a diversion. Matters, however, did not grow much smoother, and the kind efforts of Tante Francoise, and the excellent supper she provided, failed to impart anything like cordial cheerfulness to the little circle, or to banish the irritability that marked Durand's manner. "Why did you show my letters?" abruptly asked the elder brother as they sat together in Paul's bedroom after the family had separated for the night. "Because I did not think there was any harm in doing so. I supposed they would have amused father instead of annoying him. If I had kept them to myself, he might have supposed there was something terrible in them." "I scarcely know him, he is so changed," moodily resumed Armand. "What does it all mean?" "Age and rheumatism," was the curt reply. "Don't think I escape without my share of fault-finding. When anything goes wrong, even to the bolting of a stable window, you should hear him." "Poor Paul!" ejaculated Armand, the faint gleam of suspicion that had flashed across his mind vanishing at once. "It must be hard to bear." It was long past midnight before the elder brother fell asleep, for he was rendered additionally restless and wakeful by the heavy breathing of Paul; but the latter, following the time-honored rule of early to rest, was also early to rise, and when Armand, who had slept unusually late, came downstairs, he was told that breakfast was long since over, and Paul gone out an hour before on his farm tour. "Why did not Paul awake me?" he asked. "Because he knew you were not used to the hardships of early rising," returned his father, and there was a dry sarcasm in his tone that irritated the young man as much as it pained him. Aunt Ratelle soon placed an excellent breakfast before him, but his appetite was not keen, and after a few minutes spent over the meal, chiefly employed in answering dry questions propounded to him by his father regarding the progress he was making in his law studies, the hopes he had for the future, he sprang up and approached the window. Though near the middle of March, a fierce snowstorm was raging, and as he looked forth at the bleak scene before him, what can be drearier than a country landscape in a snowstorm? He felt there was a strange sympathy between it and the aching dreariness filling at the moment his own breast. Another cold question from his father, followed by a petulant reply from himself, which in turn drew forth a sarcastic remark, and his resolution was taken. Yes, he would return to town at once. The chill wintry air would be more endurable than the new and strange atmosphere of unkindness that had suddenly filled his once happy home. His intention of leaving so soon and in such weather was warmly opposed by his Aunt Ratelle, but Durand, perhaps influenced by pride, offered little opposition. On bidding him farewell, however, a sudden softening in his voice and manner almost tempted Armand to throw off all reserve and frankly ask what had chilled the deep love that had once reigned between them and rendered their intercourse such a happy one. But the fear of a repulse, of being openly told what he secretly dreaded, that it was the expense he entailed on his father which rendered the latter so reserved and irritable, prevented him. After our hero's return to town, he betook himself to the daily routine of life as diligently, but in a less joyous frame of mind than previously. Letters from home were rarer and as unsatisfactory as ever, whilst he in turn wrote but seldom, and then generally addressed himself to Paul. One pleasant afternoon that he looked unusually dull, Mrs. Martel good-naturedly insisted on his going out for a walk, as he had confined himself greatly to the house and office of late. "And please, Mr. Durand, will you kindly oblige me by bringing my poor Delima with you for a walk? She wants a little fresh air as much as you do yourself. Industrious, hard-working little creature that she is, she never thinks of taking any rest." Armand, without any great professions of interest or delight, briefly answered in the affirmative, and old Mrs. Martel, smiling and exultant, hurried off to tell her cousin to dress. Looking very charming in a simple but graceful toilette, Delima soon fluttered downstairs, and Armand, with some brief word of courtesy, opened the little gate for her to pass out. Suddenly Mrs. Martel appeared in the doorway, and breathless from the speed with which she had hurried downstairs, conjured Delima to call at her cousin Vezina's to borrow the pattern of her new cap. "'Tis rather far," hesitated Miss Laurin. "Where is it?" questioned Armand. "Near the Pied de Courant, Hochelaga." "Oh, that is very far," he replied. "'Twill fatigue Miss Laurin too much." "Not at all," hastily interrupted Mrs. Martel. "Delima is a good walker. No distance can tire her, and I particularly want my new cap for Sunday. Please oblige me, Mr. Durand." "Well, if you insist, and Miss Delima thinks she is equal to it, I am willing." And without farther parley, the young couple set off. The walk was pleasant enough, and they arrived at Mrs. Vezina's as fresh as when they started. The cap was willingly lent, and then hospitality offered. They must wait for a cup of tea. Delima's timid fear that it might detain them too late, and Armand's suggestion that a glass of milk or cider would be equally welcome, as it would permit them to start on their homeward way immediately, were resolutely resisted. The merits of the cup of tea were enhanced by hot cakes and other delicacies, the preparation of which took considerable time. So, when the feast was over, and Delima rose to put on her hat, Armand, instead of giving an approving thought to the dainty fare lately spread before him, was impatiently speculating on the lateness of the hour and the stupidity of Mrs. Martel in sending them such a distance in the evening. They immediately started for home, and the twilight was fortunately soon replaced by a remarkably clear, brilliant moonlight. Perhaps rendered nervous by the comparative lateness of the hour, Delima tripped a couple of times, so her companion felt bound in common courtesy to offer her the support of his arm. As they walked on, two lonely figures in the long dusty road, she occasionally looking up to him with that timid appealing look which becomes some women so well, the noise of wheels broke on the stillness, and a carriage came driving slowly towards them. The occupants, two ladies and a gentleman, were closely scrutinizing our pedestrians, and suddenly Armand, with a pang of inexpressible mortification, discovered that they were Mrs. de Beauvoir and her daughter, with Victor de Montenay. In reply to his low bow, two of the party nodded coldly, but Gertrude's face was slightly turned aside, and in the clear, full moonlight, he could plainly see it looked cold and haughty, as if made of marble. How he chafed at the unlucky chain of circumstances that had led him into his present position, mentally apostrophizing Mrs. Martel in terms anything but complimentary, including the fair Delima herself in the condemnation. In vain the latter looked up more winningly than ever into his face. In vain the soft pearly light added a deeper lustre to her splendid eyes, a spirituelle beauty to her sculptured features. Armand thought only of that cold, averted face, which had worn for the first time towards him a look of hauteur. "Who were those ladies in the carriage?" timidly inquired his companion, breaking a long silence. "Mrs. and Miss de Beauvoir," he curtly rejoined, unable to disguise a certain lurking irritation in his voice. "But we must walk faster, Miss Laurin. 'Tis growing very late." Little more was said on either side. Armand was in no mood for talk, and Delima, richly dowered in beauty, was not greatly so in mind or conversational powers. Arrived at home, our hero, with the briefest possible answer to Mrs. Martel's smiling welcome, hurried past her into his room. "Did he speak?" she asked in an eager whisper of her cousin, as they stood a moment in the little entrance. "Nothing to the purpose," rejoined the girl, tears of mortification glittering in her eyes. "Heavens, what a flinty heart he must have!" and Mrs. Martel elevated her hands and eyes as she spoke. "But keep up your courage, my Delima. I courted my worthy old husband in there fully 6 months before he condescended to make love to me in return. And yet, see how much he thinks of me now, and what a happy couple we are. But are you hungry, little one? I have some nice head cheese and a slice of good home-made cake in the cupboard for you." Yes, I will eat a morsel, for I scarcely touched anything at Aunt Vezina's with Mr. Armand's eyes watching me." "Bah! Do those fine gentlemen think that because a girl is pretty and delicate looking, she is to live like a bee on honey or flowers? Thank goodness, my Delima is able to eat food that can at least nourish her. Come now, to the cupboard, and then off to bed, for you must feel tired after your long and profitless walk." End of chapter 11.